Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Victoria Compton from the San Juan County Economic Development Council. We are a countywide organization that works to serve businesses, helping them in any way that we need. This past year has been an interesting test of all of our resources and all of our abilities, and we've been excited and proud to be able to serve the community with everything that we were able to do this last year. Today is Datapalooza, which typically we have actually over on Orcas. It is a data event that sprang from our annual lunch. People's eyes would start to glaze over when we delve into the data, so we set up a completely separate data event. So that's what Datapalooza is. It's a look at all of the economic trends, economic possibilities, and attempts to digest what has happened in the previous year. This year, it's going to be an interesting digestive effort. And we've got James McCafferty from Western Washington University, the Center for Economic, James, help me out here.
Business research.
Thank you. And we've also got Dr. Anneliese Vance Sherman, who is from the Employment Security Department as a data analyst. I will start quickly with a short PSA, public service announcement, and then I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Mickey Von Dassau from our office, who is going to talk about some local data, and then we'll pass it over to Anneliese and to James. So I'm going to share screen, start up our PowerPoint, and be sure and feel free to eat lunch. I brought a bowl of SpaghettiOs to eat. So I hope you'll join me in eating. Typically, when we have this event, we have a little lunch that we share, and that makes it into kind of a nicer event. So hopefully everybody's got something to nosh on. So I'm going to give you a little background on the EDC. You probably are aware that we do business support in the form of counseling and events and workshops. We work on policy and just about everything else that you can think of that a business might need or our economy might need. A couple of years ago, we also started the Knowledge Worker Network, which focused on information businesses and jobs, connecting them to other industries. So we've been working on that. We also have a big trades training initiative. We've worked on this for 7 years, programming for youth and transitioning adults. We've now trained over 100 students in things like plumbing, electrical, HVAC, and all kinds of different topics of interest in the trades. In the new normal, we have launched trades talks. We've done career fairs, online courses, and Mickey has just started working on a makerspace initiative. So that's what we were doing. And then this is the slide that shows what happened in March. I think you guys probably are fully aware of this. This is a chart from National Public Radio. It shows the sudden and devastating drop that happened in Q2 of 2020. 32.9% shrinkage for the national economy. So what did we do? We started kicking it up many notches. We started doing one-on-one counseling 7 days a week. We worked with over 300 clients. We did, because nobody else was doing it locally, we did unemployment counseling and outreach and job fairs. We rolled out events, workshops, rap sessions, community forums. We started a program called the Island Strong Gift Card Initiative, and that's online at islandstrong.com. We did job fairs to try to connect the businesses that still had jobs open with the tremendous pool of unemployed workers. And we did an online farm directory, which ultimately got along with the Ag Guild and other ag organizations, which is now run out of the Wazoo office. We helped hundreds of businesses with grant and loan assistance as well, and passed nearly $1 million through the EDC in loan or grants. And then we got the word out all about that. We also built stronger connections. Previously, we had good connections with local, state, and federal agencies and legislators, but we firmed those connections up. We reached out to any organization that could help any business in San Juan County and started building relationships with them. Mickey also worked deeply in data analysis and policy work over this last year. We retained, through our efforts, a minimum of 474 jobs directly, and supported 1,900 jobs and $41 million in PPP loans, which we worked on with the banks and other entities to get to San Juan County's businesses. So what next? We remember that slide where we watched that 33% drop in previous recessions, 2008, 2001 that I've seen. I've been at the EDC for 11 years and lived here for a couple of decades before that. Watching what happens because of our concentration on a couple of narrow industry channels, we always get walloped. So right now we need to think about ways we need to help our businesses sort out what just happened. We need to help them do the reporting on their debts and grants and everything else, learn how to adapt and get more resilient. And we also have to continue to get those grants to businesses, continue to offer that counseling and support, and continue, as I said, to diversify our economy. And my hope is that by having this conversation today, we will never have this conversation again, that we'll be able to kick off some thoughts that we'll be able to carry with us in an effort to get to the next economy. Keep what we've got, expand into new things to mitigate the cyclicality and the vulnerability of our economy. And to that end, on January 27th, we will have a next economy conversation. So I will be sending out information on that, and I hope you can join us. And now I'm going to pass you to Mickey, who has some charts.
Thank you, Victoria. So we all know that the accommodations businesses were particularly hard hit because not just of mandatory closures, but also a lot of voluntary reduction in travel that started happening even before those closures. So the previous slide was showing the tax, hotel motel tax in, can you go back to the previous slide, Victoria? Was showing the hotel motel tax in Friday Harbor, and the county is similar. And so the blue lines are the previous 4 years. The red line is this year. And as you can see, we've lost a huge amount in terms of the accommodations businesses. Next slide. Our guest speakers are going to be talking a lot more about jobs, but I did want to introduce a little bit here, and mostly to set them, help set them up, and they're going to be diving into this in a lot more detail. But as Victoria mentioned, we've sort of concentrated on a couple of industries, and one of those is the tourism, which is very, very seasonal and took a really hard hit in this pandemic. So this is leisure and hospitality is shown in orange. Another one of our biggest industries is construction, which is lumped in with goods producing industries. It's the biggest one in our community. Manufacturing is also in there, but it's much, much smaller. And they're much less seasonal, and they took a hit in the pandemic, but in terms of job numbers, they didn't decline nearly so much. Similarly, other smaller industries like information and financial activities are much less seasonal and took much less of a hit. Next slide, please. But I wanted to make sure that you recognize that each crisis is different than past behaviors and a guarantee of future performance. So these are selected industries. So on the left, this is actually a different data source that includes all jobs rather than just jobs covered by unemployment insurance. So it includes proprietors and contractors as well. And as you can see in the 2008-2009 recession, the tourism accommodations and services businesses took a hit, but they recovered fairly quickly and they grew considerably afterwards. In contrast, construction took a much bigger hit, and it never fully recovered job numbers as of 2019 to pre-recession levels. If we look on the right, those are some of the other industries that a lot of people around here are really interested in seeing in our community. And they behaved very differently from these other two industries. Some of them grew like arts and rec. Some of them were kind of steady like the farms and the information, but were somewhat stagnant. So just again, each crisis has been a bit different. Next slide, please.
Uh-oh, sorry, it's not working. Hang on a moo. Whoop. Let's do it this way. I think we had a little internet hang up here. Goodness gracious. There we go.
So I wanted to talk, there's a few things that are sort of unusual about our community. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was the fact that we have much smaller businesses here. And one of the things that means is we have a lot higher proportion of self-employed business individuals in comparison to our larger counties next door or the state or the country as a whole. And these self-employed people have typically a lot less access to social safety nets and other programs. We also have a lot more people employed in really small businesses, which may or may not have as much access to resources to sort of keep the business going, even if they lay off people and rehire people as things improve. The other side to that, though, is we may potentially have the people with the skills to jumpstart regrowth with entrepreneurship, build new businesses and build into new industries. And with that, I want to pass this back to Victoria to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mickey. I also wanted to mention too, a little protocol. Let's put any questions. I've muted everybody so that we can get through James and Anneliese's presentation without side conversations or whatever. But if you could put your chat, your questions into the chat. The chat button is at the bottom of the screen for you. I think pretty much on a cell phone, it'll look about the same, and just send questions. And then we'll open it up to everybody to talk at the end as well. So with that, let me hand this over to James. Do you want to go ahead and introduce your presentation with Anneliese or Anneliese?
Yeah, no, we'll just jump in. So
great.
And I want to echo again, just drop stuff in the chat, because as we go here along, we may grab questions and respond to those as we kind of go through as well. So don't be shy with that. So Victoria, I made a joke here with Datapalooza with Zoomapalooza, so just kind of go with this. So Anneliese and I live in our different worlds, and we have different rules that govern what we do. So you're going to see slides from both of us, and so they look differently. So you know who's responsible for what, just to keep us clear with those above us both. So just so you can understand what's going on there. So Anneliese, do you have any comments out of the gate?
No, let's Zoomapalooza.
Let's Zoomapalooza. All right. Who wouldn't want to do that? So let's start with COVID, because it's the obvious place to start. So let's unpack some things that we know about COVID looking forward, because that starts to inform us better about what to expect in the months ahead and then where things are going to go. So there's no other way to cut it. Now through March is going to be pretty intense. It's going to be intense it's going to be a different kind of intense, but it's going to be just like a year ago intense. We're gonna see a lot of numbers come at us here in the next few weeks that are going to be a little bit overwhelming for a lot of folks. So I'll give you a little idea of where we think those are heading. And these numbers are coming out of the UW's COVID model, which is updated every day. Which makes my life fun, because I keep having to go in and look at it and look at the trends of what's going on. So right now, we're averaging about 13 deaths per day as a state. By February, that's expected to be about 53 per day. We're going to go from a statistic of about 30% of Americans know someone who's either died or been severely impacted from COVID, to being close to 100% statistically. And that's going to be, and that'll happen over the next few weeks. And so that's gonna give people some pause to think about on where we're going. So in about 2 weeks or so, we're going to see this this big climb. So if I were to chart this out for you, the way you look at these charts, the red line that's solid there, that's actual hard data. You notice there's a dotted line that gets us to today, which was actually yesterday. There's a data lag in collecting data, and so something we don't normally have to think about too much. With the COVID data and economic data related to COVID, we're having to spend a lot of time thinking about that data lag and what's happening between right now and when we actually have hard data. So these different colored lines, the green line there is if everyone could just mask up and keep distances and do that kind of thing. That's the projection. With the rapid vaccine rollout, you can see that blue line there, and you can see where it goes up and then it comes down pretty sharply. And of course, the red line there is if we just kind of said, well, we'll be all right. We don't need to worry about it. And mandates kind of eased up a little bit. And the current projection is that line in between there. So you can see that where the vaccine starts to make a difference. So it's going to take until we get into the middle of February before we start to see some numerical impact, or the end of February, before we saw numerical impact for the rapid vaccine rollout. If we think about the rate of infections, we're currently reporting about 3,700 per day in our state. And that's expected to climb to about 7,500 by late January. It's not because we're doing more testing. More people are getting COVID. There's an exponential rate to it, and we are on the not the good side of the exponential rate of growth. We've already started this climb. We were at around 1,000 per cases per day in October. So we've already almost quadrupled the number of cases since October. And you can see how that climb's going to work. These are expected to start to decrease as we get into February. And you can here again, you can see where the vaccine rollout helps to, again, it's the same basic presentation you saw on the other data, where you can see where the rollout's going to allow us to do that, to start bringing those numbers down. Mobility is where this really kind of hits the pavement, if you will, or non-pavement, as the case may be. It's really what happens as people react to all this. So last April, we were at about a negative 53% mobility. That means about half the people that normally would be moving around were not. And so this data comes from cell phone data, all anonymous, so you don't have to worry about privacy type things, but it's mobility is tracked through cell phone trafficking. And we're able to see how that goes. So we're at about a negative 22% now. And again, this is all Washington State. That's expected to drop to about a negative 38% in March. And what's interesting here is that we're expecting to see that negative 38% kind of hold. You're not seeing a big there's no hockey stick movement going here. It's going to stabilize a little bit. This may be being influenced by some very large employers in our state saying they're going to stay and work remote until July. I'm sure there's some other things in this as well, but there's a lot of movement here in not moving, and this is what's feeding some of the fears about restaurants and other businesses that really depend on people going out and about. People are not going out and about, and that's an impact that we're going to have to watch. Question here about mobility, that's just people moving around. It's just people going out and living their lives and doing stuff, right? So if we're talking about a decrease in mobility, it means that's a shortfall in people going out. So people aren't going to the grocery store, people aren't going on vacation, people aren't going to work. They're working from home. So people are staying close to home. So hospital use is a big metric, and it gets bantered around quite a bit. And this really varies by state. I mean, really varies by state. This round of COVID is going to be very different than what we saw in the last round, because it's going to be a lot younger patients, and we know they have a higher survival rate anyway. We also have a lot better medical approaches, which have increased survival rates. So we expect to see fewer deaths per hospitalization. And yet I told you the death rate is going to go up very sharply. And that's just, it's a volume. There's going to be so many people that have COVID. It's more likely for people to get it that have underlying conditions and other things that are going to get them the least desired outcome. And it's the problem with hospitalization is that we're already maxing out some states. And those states are moving people to other states like ours that are not. So for example, Idaho, Utah, and a number of other states are maxing out their capacity. So if we just look at Washington State, I want to draw your attention to the purple plume here. You'll notice the ICU beds, we've already maxed out our ICU beds in our state. And that is a concern, of course, but we haven't maxed out all beds. And you can see that big gap there between the purple line. The plume there is the margin of error. And so the further out you go, the bigger that margin of error gets in the math. Now, what this doesn't account for is people being moved into our state and those kinds of concerns. So that's why you'll hear things, well, we're out of beds. Well, we are out of ICU beds. We're not out of total beds. Some states are out of total beds, and that's especially problematic. This is from today's New York Times. This is a heat map of counties where ICU beds are occupied. You'll see Washington State, we've got multiple counties that are 100% maxed out on their ICU beds. Other states have much bigger pockets than what we have. North Dakota, South Dakota have been in the news today. Texas has been in the news. We haven't heard a lot of New Mexico, but New Mexico's got some significant problems. And Utah, while it doesn't show prominently on this map, they have some significant challenges as well. So this map is going to get worse before it gets better. Vaccine development, you guys have seen the news on this. There's multiple vaccines out there. Early data showing that the 2 vaccines that look like they're going to be deployed in the United States first have above 90% effective rates. Couple cautions with that. They're two-dose approaches. You got to get someone to go in twice. They're not fun vaccines. They're not like if you enjoy the Tdap, maybe you'll really enjoy this. It's not a pleasant vaccine to go through. And so it's definitely necessary, and it's better than getting the disease. It is for adults only. There is no children's vaccine. There won't be a children's vaccine for another year or 2. It takes a lot longer to develop those. These are not peer reviewed at this point. They're very small samples that are using them. So expect to see stories about, reactions and different things. But again, we're all part of the science here. The trick to this really is that we need 70% of the population to be vaccinated before this actually works. Until we get to 70%, you're going to continue to see mobility low. You're going to continue to see businesses struggle. You're going to continue to see us move through here. So just the chart here just shows you there's 11 vaccines that are in this phase 3 moving towards approved. And we also, from a best case scenario here in the United States, as of Monday, and that changed on Monday, was if we assumed perfect distribution, we're talking about May to get there. But we already know there's supply chain problems. We already know this is not good. This is fantasy land. So we've continued to say July is our likely target to see where we're going to probably be close to that 70%. Again, this is a heat map of COVID cases in the United States, and you can see density matters. You can also see the rural areas are getting just as hard as the non-rural communities. Mask use may increase, which would help. You saw the change in the charts there. Currently, Washington State's at 72%. The U.S. is in the 60s. The November holidays have definitely created bubbles in spreading. December holidays are expected to be worse. We expect to see in January, that's partially what you saw in those charts in the January climb, is the people coming back from their December holidays and bringing back souvenirs. We expect to see supply chain challenges. I mentioned July, and air travel is continuing to rebound, but business travel is not expected to completely recover. And that's going to impact a pretty big chunk of the U.S. economy for years to come as business travel gets reduced 30 to 40%. Anneliese, any words on unemployment labor force?
Well, I think thank you for introducing it in terms of the COVID crisis, the pandemic, because I think that that's really the environment we're focusing in. So my presentation is going to be a little different this time. I tend to focus on the employment and unemployment situation, and I will still do that, but with some caveats that some things have changed. And specifically, we are looking at a very different set of circumstances. So next slide. All right, so just looking at the unemployment rate in Washington State as well as San Juan County, I think the word of the year, or at least one contender for the word of the year this year, is going to be unprecedented. And you're going to see in a series of slides that I'll be rolling out what unprecedented really looks like. So when we talk about the unemployment rate spiking like we've never seen before, this is what we're talking about. So statewide, the blue line reached 16.1% statewide, and in San Juan County reached 17.8% in April. So this is the highest unemployment rate we have on record locally or statewide, nationally as well, going back to the Great Depression. So this hit hard, it hit fast, and created a lot of data challenges for us, as well as a lot of societal challenges for sure. Another thing I'm going to point out is that we have seen the unemployment rate go down quite significantly. At this point, the most recent reading for San Juan County was 5%, and statewide, a little bit approaching 6%. I believe it's 5.8%. One thing I will point out when we're looking at the unemployment rate, well, first of all, we've got the cyclicality, which was mentioned in the previous segment. These numbers are going to be revised, and I'm anticipating that there will be a lot of revisions to these numbers as we move forward. So part of the process, we always go through these revisions, but because of the shock that we had to the system at this particular junction, I expect to be seeing these revisions moving forward. I see the question, 5% smaller workforce. The workforce, I don't have that slide handy. What this represents is the portion of the workforce that is actively seeking employment based on our models. Okay, next slide.
At least that is the trick with unemployment, isn't it? That it's a very slice of the population that goes into this. It's people that are actively looking for work.
Right. So when we're looking at when we're calculating the unemployment rate, what we're looking at is the portion of the labor force, and we define the labor force as people who either are looking for work or have a job. So already we're at a segment of the population, a very specific segment, and then we're just looking at the portion of those who are looking for work.
So in theory, we could come back and have the same unemployment rate as we had a year ago, but if the workforce is smaller, it's just fewer people because people have removed themselves. Okay. I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
Yep, and sometimes it can do really wonky things where we'll see a lot of job opportunities and the unemployment rate goes up because more people are looking for work because they know there are opportunities. So it can move around quite a bit. Looking around the state, San Juan County currently 5%, one of the lower unemployment rates around the state. We've reverted to some of our normal patterns with some of our most rural counties having the highest unemployment rates. And some of the areas such as King County, 4.7%, one of our lower unemployment rates, partially in large part because a lot of the jobs, proportionally speaking, can be done at home. We're talking about industries such as finance and professional business services, some of these jobs that can be done from home. So next slide, please.
Anneliese, are self-employed ever counted in unemployment numbers?
In the unemployment numbers, yes. So when we're looking at labor force and unemployment, that's going to include self-employed. When we switch over to payroll, that's not going to. Again, unprecedented year. This is what initial claims look like going back to 2005. The highest that we ever had on record up until this crisis was 167 claims in December of 2008, which was a lot of claims for San Juan County. Fast forward to April 2020, we had 1,287 claims. So when you hear about what was happening in the unemployment insurance system, this is what was happening in the unemployment insurance system. Next slide, please. But one thing that was also a challenge moving ahead is that we've always got a little bit of a lag to our data, about 5 weeks from the time that data are collected to when they're actually published. Normally, this is not that big of a problem. Even when we go into a normal recession, there's enough information that lag is a little bit annoying, but it's not a big problem. This time it was a problem because we went into an immediate crisis and our data were still showing record low unemployment rates. So that was a little bit of a problem. We shifted. We have a very nimble data set, which is the unemployment insurance information, which is submitted to the Department of Labor on a weekly basis. So we focused quite a bit on the weekly unemployment insurance claims. So this is looking at Washington State, and a couple points I'm going to show you. First of all, we were looking at about 8,000 claims per week coming in statewide as kind of a normal rate. And then the week of March 8th to 14th, we saw a doubling of claims. And it barely shows up on this. But that particular week, we saw some of the the rollout of some regulations specifically targeting Kings, Snohomish, and Pierce counties, since that's where the virus was primarily showing up. The following week, the week of March 15th to 21st, is when we saw dining rooms shut down, bars, a lot of different businesses that have that face-to-face contact inherent in their business model shut down. And that's when we saw a large influx of claims. A couple other weeks I'm going to point to. So after that initial wave where we reached over 181,000 claims in one single week, we then have week 16 in mid-April when PUA became available. This is going to be important when we think about our entrepreneurs, our people that are not traditionally in the unemployment insurance system. We saw a big increase in the number of claims that particular week when it was made available. After that, you start to see fraud show up, then you see that fraud shut down. And we've reached kind of this point where we're at a relatively level point, but that level point is hovering around 20,000 claims per week. Normally at this time of year, we would see about 8,000 claims per week. So we're not out of the woods yet. This is a very sensitive measure because weekly claims is just how many people are knocking on the door, opening a claim for the first time or reopening a claim. This tells me that we still have a lot of layoffs continuing to happen. Next slide, please.
And at least the UI systems were never designed for this volume, either in state or nationally. And that's been part of the big challenge for your colleagues is that, I mean, I saw the ads go up for programmers that knew COBOL because that's what the software is written in. Because there's struggle to get the software to work functionally. So my takeaway up from this slide is expect to hear a lot of conversations about upgrading and updating our UI systems because they have done an heroic job with systems that were never built for what they've had them do.
I will also add that around the state, I'm extremely proud of the work that we have done as an agency, given that we faced this crisis. And absolutely, there were things that went wrong for sure. And I think everybody acknowledges that. But I can tell you the WorkSource offices around the state, most of the WorkSource employees were trained on unemployment insurance. We are really innovating and working around how to deal with this kind of volume. Looking specifically at San Juan County, what I'm going to point out is that the week when we had the largest number of claims in San Juan County was that week of April 19th to 25th. That was the week when PUA, again, the unemployment insurance claims that were made available to people that are not traditionally in the unemployment insurance system was made available. So, to the point that was made in Mickey's presentation about entrepreneurship in San Juan County, that's absolutely showing up when we look at the timing of initial claims activity in San Juan County.
Checking my glossary for PUA. What's that mean, Anneliese?
Yeah, PUA is Pandemic Unemployment Assurance. That's the federal program that extended unemployment insurance benefits to people such as gig workers, entrepreneurs, people that are not normally paying into and therefore covered by the state unemployment insurance systems. So this is, again, to James's point, our system was not made for this kind of crisis, but because we have the infrastructure in our state and federal unemployment insurance systems to handle connecting to people that are in need and connecting to employers, we were kind of moved into this space of being more than just unemployment insurance, but kind of a broader social safety net. Another thing I'm just going to point out, because this becomes important when we think about moving ahead, one of the criteria for traditional unemployment insurance is a job search requirement. That's the contract between the employer, the former employee, and the state, is that you'll receive unemployment insurance as long as you are agreeing to continue to look for work that got suspended because the primary goal this time around was not to get people back connected to work rapidly. It was really about helping people to be sustainable, to sustain themselves during this crisis, and to minimize face-to-face contact. So job search requirement went away. When will it be coming back is a big question. We've had a number of different dates when we projected that we'd start, and we've blown past those dates because James's initial slides tell that story. As long as we're still seeing stay-at-home requirements, and as long as we're still seeing the need to minimize face-to-face contact, there's going to be continual reevaluation of when to reintroduce that job search requirement. For now, the target date is in January at this point. The most recent data point that we have looking at this slide references 49 claims, week 47 in San Juan County. Last year at this time, there were 8. So again, comparatively speaking, just we're still in crisis. Next slide, please. Continued claims, again, unprecedented. We went from a seasonal peak, an all-time peak, January 2010 with 330 claims, to May of 2020 with 1,053 claims. Next slide, please. And continued claims refers to the number of people that are actually collecting unemployment insurance, not just that knock on the door, but they've gone through the system, they've been approved, and they are collecting checks. One thing we've been doing is taking a closer look at who is claiming unemployment insurance. And so what we're able to do is kind of take a look at the continued claims for the most recent week, and we get a pretty good picture of who is unemployed. So the next couple slides detail some of what we know about unemployment insurance claimants in San Juan County specifically. So not a huge surprise, accommodation and food services shows up with the largest number of claims, 76 this past week is what we counted. Healthcare and social assistance, 32, educational services with 22, retail trade with 16, manufacturing, construction, and so on. One thing that we noticed when we were looking at industries, one of my colleagues and I, as we entered into this crisis, took out a couple pens and napkins and kind of compared notes, what do we think is going to happen? And there were a couple surprises. First of all, I think we expected accommodation and food services would be impacted to a very large extent, and absolutely that was the case. Health care and social assistance came as a little bit of a surprise to us because you're thinking, it's a healthcare crisis. We will have an absolute need for healthcare workers. But healthcare workers themselves, the diversity of the occupation, the diversity of the industry really showed up as we started to seeing claims flooding in from dental hygienists and from people working in doctor's offices and, and a lot of the smaller practices that got shut down because of that question of face-to-face contact. We also saw a lot of elective surgeries postponed. And so, we started seeing a lot of claims coming in from different parts of the healthcare system, even though certain parts of the healthcare system absolutely had extremely high demand. So a lot of shifting there. Another thing that became abundantly clear early on is that, yes, while we are seeing those occupations and industries that have a lot of face-to-face contact showing up in the largest volumes, every single industry is showing up. It's impacting everybody in some way, shape, or form. And, that's one thing, part of what defines it as a recession as well, that this is it doesn't just touch a couple different industries. We really are seeing that across the board in different ways, but we're seeing them all in our unemployment insurance system these days. Next slide. Slightly different cut, looking at occupation or the types of tasks people are doing. Statewide and San Juan County looking pretty similar in terms of some of these snapshots, but I'll just point out food preparation and serving, management, office and administrative support. The food preparation and serving, again, not a surprise because the industry that's being most impacted is leisure and hospitality. Management, locally and statewide, shows up quite a bit. Office and administrative support as well. So again, these are jobs that often have a face-to-face component involved in them. These are also jobs that are very large in terms of the size of the workforce. So there is just partially numbers. I'll also point out, not so much in San Juan County, but in some of the neighboring counties, production is showing up to a large extent as more and more crises around Boeing and aircraft production that are directly related to tourism and directly related to air travel start to show up. They're showing up, kind of rising in the numbers as well. Next slide.
Anneliese, people that could, there's a little more leniency given for people that felt they had a pre-existing condition or were more at risk. They could step away from their job and still apply for unemployment, et cetera, right? There was more leniency there?
Well, in terms of, we've suspended the job search requirement. That's a big part of it. We also have, within, again, there's a lot of different parts of the bureaucracy, so I'm not going to say anything specific about whether a claim can be approved or not. That's not my bailiwick. But I'm also going to point out, as we've entered into this, we were finalizing the statewide paid family and medical leave, which is also handled in ESD. So that's become more available. So in a way, our social network our social safety network has expanded, and the timing of that expansion in some ways is fortunate, but still couldn't handle the volume we're getting right now. But you do raise a really good point that once that job search requirement goes away, and again, it's projected right now to be in January 19th is when it's projected to be reinstated. I, quite frankly, will expect that to probably be pushed back again, depending on what's happening with the COVID numbers. But one effect that I think we'll see in the data is suddenly we'll see a drop off in the number of unemployment insurance claims, which on the surface looks like a good thing. It looks like the economy is recovering, and it could actually just mean that a lot of people lost their social safety net, and we could start seeing impacts in other, food distribution systems and TANF and, DSHS, food stamps. A lot of different programs could see a wave of impact related to that.
I think the other statistic that's interesting is that a lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic, when they initially filed, said, oh no, I have a job, it's waiting for me when I come back. And that may or may not be true, because the underlying business may not be there, or may spin back up in a different form. So this is
Sure.
one of those, we could probably do an hour just on a couple slides here, I think, because that's kind of interesting. But this I find really interesting. So talk to me about women.
Well, first I'm going to take a step back and say we collect warn notices from employers. Large employers, before they have a layoff, are asked to contact ESD and let us know if they've got a plan to lay off. And at the beginning, we saw a flood of claims coming in, especially from, a flood of warn notices coming in, especially from employers in leisure and hospitality. And they all said temporary, 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 temporary. And then we started seeing them that said some temporary, some permanent. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're still seeing some optimism in terms of temporary layoff as opposed to permanent, but we are also seeing an increasing proportion of layoffs being reported as permanent. Looking at the slide here, in San Juan County, just comparing the employed labor force. So I'm not looking at the population as a whole, just the portion of the labor force that 2014 to 2018 was representative of the employed labor force, compared with the orange bars, which are the most recent snapshot of unemployment insurance claimants. And so what we can see is that the last recession was sometimes termed the man session. We saw industries, as Mickey pointed out, such as construction and manufacturing that tend to be disproportionately male in terms of the composition of the workforce. This time around, some of the industries that have been hit the hardest, again, include leisure and hospitality and include healthcare. And these are industries and occupations that tend to skew a little bit more towards women in the workforce. So we are seeing a larger portion of women that are being reported as unemployed right now. Again, this is looking at unemployment insurance claims, and I expect to see that when the job search requirement comes back. We'll probably see a big drop in the number of women that are reported as unemployed because a lot of them will have dropped out of the workforce. And specifically, I'm thinking about the role of online schooling and, you know, which jobs disappeared. Again, industries that tend to be more likely to have women. So women are more likely to have lost their jobs. They're also more likely to be home with kids during this time. So unless childcare and school resume and these jobs start to come back, this already is showing its mark on women in the workforce and is likely to continue to.
I'll remind you, without a children's vaccine, there'll be next year, there'll likely be more kids that are kept in a homeschool type setting than we'd see normally. So this impact's gonna have a shadow to it for at least a few years.
Mm-hmm. Just looking at San Juan County, for the most part, you know, one of the things that this recession has also done, and most recessions do to a certain extent, but this one really exposed a lot of the inequalities, a lot of the social and economic challenges that we've already been facing in terms of people that were already more vulnerable are being shown to be even more vulnerable now. And this tends to be a repeatable pattern during recessions, more so during this last one. But I'll just point out, you know, I think the number that probably shows up most clearly for San Juan County, anytime there's an asterisk, by the way, it means a small enough number that we can't report it. Caucasian population of the employed labor force prior to the recession made up about 91% of the workforce, and they make up about 83% of unemployment insurance claims. So disproportionate, you know, they're less likely to be unemployed right now. Next slide. Younger workers. Again, when we think about which industries were hit the hardest, this makes sense implicitly. It's also a pattern that we tend to see during most recessions, with the younger part of the workforce being shed first. So again, a lot of younger workers in leisure and hospitality, and that's part of what's showing up in San Juan County. But you know, also these are also a lot of the lower wage workers, a lot of people that are entering into the workforce for the first time. So just in terms of the proportion of the workforce, you know, again, looking at the blue, you know, proportion of the workforce, we tend to have our largest proportion in San Juan County among 55 to 64. But in terms of the largest number of unemployment insurance claims, proportionally speaking, 25 to 34-year-olds. So, yeah, there is a bit of a challenge there, particularly with younger workers. Anything you want to add, James?
No, this stuff is, I mean, again, I think by the time we're done here today, people are gonna have their hands around kind of the complexities of this. So this is fabulous. I'm waiting for your next slide.
All right. We always know any given snapshot in time that that education is a great insurance policy. You know, the more formal education you have, the more likely you are in any given snapshot in time to, the more education you have, the more likely you are to be employed in any given snapshot in time. This also correlates positively with wages. The inverse is also true. Lower levels of education, you're more likely to be unemployed when there are shocks that hit the system. One thing I'm going to point out, at the end, there 5.5% not disclosed. That's distributed through, again, small numbers and aggregations. Some of that's PhDs, most of it's going to be less than high school. But what we can see is that where we have Those with less than a bachelor's degree are more likely to be unemployed relative to the size of the workforce. And those that have a bachelor's degree or higher, again, it's a good insurance policy. 41.2% of the workforce has a bachelor's degree or higher, but they only make up 28.6% of the unemployment insurance claims that have come in. Okay, next slide. Okay, switching to payroll employment. When finally our payroll employment caught up, we ended up seeing more or less a mirror. So we were collecting unemployment insurance information, which helped us glean information about who was unemployed, who was being laid off. And then finally the unemployment or the payroll, our survey of employers caught up, and we were able to kind of compare that. And the story is really strikingly similar, which tells us a lot about the data quality, that there is some quality to that data that we were collecting. But overall, here's what the trend has looked like. We saw statewide, if you look to the left, this is just a tally of non-farm employment in Washington State as a whole. And you can see, well, first of all, it gets a little chunky, and part of that's that our algorithm is having trouble with seasonality because this threw everything off. So again, when I say there are going to be revisions, that's going to be part of it. But the dip that we took from March to April brought us down to about where we were in 2014. Since then, we've seen quite a bit of, about half of those jobs return, which is really good, but it brings us back to about where we were in 2016. So just starting from today, when we think about what recovery is going to look like, if it takes a similar, if we are able to get our recovery in gear and we're able to keep it at about that 2 to 3% clip that we were at before going into this crisis, then we're about 3 years out from reaching pre-recession levels. The next half of this, you can see just what does that employment change look like, and I'm just going to point out, again, unprecedented dip. Then we start to see the green bars, jobs coming back, jobs coming back, jobs coming back, jobs coming back, but a little bit less, jobs coming back and barely noticeable. I expect to see this moving forward. So, there's two stories here. One is that, that this was a devastating drop. But when we start to see the recovery, I'm seeing a very rapid recovery to begin with. I'm seeing innovation. I'm seeing businesses figuring out, okay, we're in a highly uncertain environment. What can we do to build in a little bit of certainty? And so we see the plexiglass go up. We see the stickers on the floors. We see mandatory masks, and figuring out how to, curbside pickup, figuring out how to innovate and move forward in this highly uncertain environment. But there is going to, it is going to slow down moving forward. Next slide.
Sorry, there we go.
All right. San Juan County, it's all about seasonality. And so as much as I like to sometimes tease out the seasonality, that's not the story of San Juan County. The seasonality is a big part of it. We lost summer. This crisis, you can see, and as we enter into 2020, you reach your low point in January. February, you start to build up that workforce again, and March, and then April hits. And when you're normally building up to the summer, you're taking that huge dive. Summer essentially didn't happen. We saw some increases from May to June, but those brought us back to about where we were in January, which is basically summer didn't happen in San Juan County this year, and that's what you're seeing in that final segment. Next slide. So completely threw off the cyclicality. Same data, different view. Next slide. All industries have been impacted, as I pointed out, but they've been able to navigate differently. But navigating, you've got both the supply and the demand piece of that. You can put up all the plexiglass you want and require masks, but if people don't feel comfortable dining out, they won't. The industry that's hit the hardest, again, leisure and hospitality. I'm just going to point out a couple of these. Leisure and hospitality dove to about, lost about more than 30% of all the jobs compared to January. Saw an uptick in jobs consistent with the season, but seeing that decline in jobs, again, consistent with the season. Trade, transportation, and utilities includes retail trade. This is one that dipped pretty far, managed to come back to a certain extent. A lot of this is going to be the story of the mix of activities that are involved in that. A lot of this is going to be retail. And the question is, what's your mix of retail look like? Grocery stores have been doing great. Shoe stores, not so much. So when we think about, some measures show retail doing extremely well, and James will be able to get into that a little bit with consumer data. Overall, retail not doing so bad, but when we dig down into some of the specific industries that are contained within retail and related activities, we get some very different pictures. Another one I'll point out, education and health services, another one that's been struggling. Again, I expect to see some of this return, but a lot of that's going to depend on how safe people feel going back to, eventually you're going to go back to the dentist. If you've got a toothache, eventually you're going to go back. Eventually you're going to go back to your physical therapist, but maybe not until you feel safe doing so. So that's another industry that's been hit pretty hard. Next slide. And just putting some numbers to it, I'm not going to read through all of these, but I'll just point out San Juan County has been hit disproportionately hard. Statewide, we're down about 5% over the year. San Juan County down about 17%. That's entirely because of the proportion of jobs that are wrapped up in leisure and hospitality, as well as education and health services. These are the two industries that were hit the hardest. Leisure and hospitality at this point, comparing year over year, down 44%. Education and health services, year over year comparison, down 20%. And the one bright spot, professional business services, is actually up slightly over the year. So that's one area of improvement. But for the most part, this is what we're dealing with. Okay, I'll turn it back over to James.
All right, so we're going to dive into economics as a social science, and this is where this gets kind of fun to think through. So one of the challenges is, as both Anneliese and I pointed out here, is the data legs make this really hard to do some of this. And some of the data that we normally rely on has a 6-month lag. That's not going to do. So we're having to rely on more high frequency data. And so through Opportunity Insights, which is a project out of Harvard, they're using credit card data, cell phone data, and other types of data that can be updated on a weekly basis to get a better idea of what's going on. And so this is a percent change in the United States employment based on household wage. So we're using cell phone data to locate people, identifying that cell phone data stream as being from a high wage neighborhood, a middle wage neighborhood, or a low wage neighborhood. And there's a lot of data sources at play here to make this happen. And so the high wage category they use at $60,000, which is, if you're living in Seattle, that's not really high wage, but if you're living in Arkansas, it is. So it's all based on national numbers. But when we look at employment nationally, those high wage jobs, those we've seen a recovery there. It's the middle wage, still down a little bit, but those low wage jobs, the retail, the food service, arts, entertainment, that's where we're seeing the unemployment. And so again, from an equity concern, we're seeing the folks that were in those low wage jobs are really the ones that have carried the burden, if you will, of the economy being diminished. And so when we look at employment in Washington state, we see a very similar story. High wage jobs are down a little bit, and that's partly a story of the fact that $60,000 isn't the same here in Washington state. And you can see here how the impacts are looking in these different wage bands. When we think about consumer spending is where it gets kind of interesting, because what you'd expect to happen is the exact opposite. We find in our low-income households that their average consumer spending has actually increased in the United States, almost 2%. Total spending has gone down about 2.5%, but that's being carried by those high-income households, which are spending about 6% less, and that's the U.S. If we look at that for Washington state, the low-income spending is up even higher. Total spend's actually up a little bit. And some counties in Washington, like Skagit County, this data is not available for all the counties, so it's not available for San Juan. But in Skagit County, the total spend is up actually double digits percentage. And there's a lot of questions around why, right? How is consumer spending gone up? Part of it's a stimulus story, and part of it is a story of people deciding to spend their money differently. And so if I'm not going to lose my housing because I don't pay my rent, I'm less likely to pay my rent and more likely to go buy groceries, which is from a societal standpoint, that's not a great decision, having to force that decision on anyone, but that's what's happening. Same thing's happening with utilities. Utilities are showing large increases in unpaid utility bills. And so that money's being reallocated. When we think about small businesses being open, so in Washington State, when we look at small business, the percentages of small businesses being open, and this time we're going to slice it up into where that business is located. Are they located in a neighborhood with a lower income or a higher income? And we find that the higher income neighborhoods are seeing more of their businesses closed. And that sounds counterintuitive until you think about the fact that the people in those high income neighborhoods aren't spending their money. They're not going to the fancy restaurants. They're not doing the activities they would normally do. And so that's why. And so again, we have this really interesting equity thing of who's being impacted and how. When we look at in the Seattle MSA, so this is really Snohomish, King, and Pierce counties, and we look at the changes in the number of businesses that are being opened, we see a 46% drop in leisure and hospitality, for example, a 28% drop overall, 16% in retail and transportation. These are your two biggest areas that have been hit, and where we see those unemployment numbers that Anneliese was showing as well. So that's really, really common, and it's a story around the nation, not just in our yard. When we think about percent change in consumer spending in the Seattle MSA again, and again, this data is just not available in a lot of areas. So it's just the larger MSAs. We see a 10% increase in grocery. And this, of course, you can see this ended the week of November 22nd, about a negative 8% total drop and a negative 54% in restaurants and hotels. What's interesting about this, the week prior, grocery was up 20-some%. And I'm guessing it's just where people decided how to do their Thanksgiving shopping. Has influenced that. So this is a fun data set that gets updated every week, that we and it does have sharp changes week to week. So if you're a data nerd, it's a good place to go. You can check this data out yourself. It's at tracktherecovery.org. It is a fun way to go in and again, just kind of see what's going on. So that moves us to what to expect from here. Where do we look from a forecast perspective? And I'm not going to bury you in a lot of forecast data. You saw earlier from Mickey the GDP. You saw the big drop there, which you can see here in context from what that looks like from 2010 to today. I mean, it's a sizable drop, but you see we didn't go back in time that far. We went back in time a couple of years based on GDP. But it still doesn't minimize what that is. So if we zoom in on that and we look at that, what we see in the different quarters here, and so you see the different, like Victoria mentioned the 31% drop that we saw in Q2. And again, these numbers get revised. So as 6 to 9 months out, they all get revised. I want you to do a little math here though, because we didn't really contract GDP by 31%. Well, you have to do, that's an annualized number. And so the short way you could do, well, it's about an 8% drop, 7 point something for that quarter. And so when we came back up in Q3 of this year to 33%, it didn't erase the 31, because if I had $100 and I lose 30%, I have $70. If I add 30%, I don't have $100, right? Fifth grade math was hard, right? It's all fifth grade math, but it's never communicated this way. So remember, GDP is always communicated as an annualized figure. And so it's just keep that in your back of your mind. So what the question becomes, what happens to this quarter? What happens to the following quarters? I can tell you that there's a growing consensus among economists that we're going to see a double dip recession, that we are likely to see Q4 be flat, close to flat, maybe be a little negative, a little bit positive, but close to flat. And then we are likely to see a negative Q1. But we're going to turn that corner very sharp, just like we did here. It's going to be a quarter, maybe two, and we're right back off to the races, because this is a disaster-based recession. It's not because of an underlying economic problem. There's nothing wrong with the economy. It's disaster-based. So it's like having a flood, it's having a fire. San Juan's a couple of years ago, you guys lost your phones and internet. It's the same concept, right? I mean, it's a short-lived problem that can be resolved. So this recovery process, GDP is actually expected to recover around the end of next year, early the following, and unemployment, normally labor market typically follows GDP by about 6 to 9 months. And so again, thinking forward where we expect things to fall, it's a pretty fast recovery, not quite a V. We've struggled to articulate a good shape for this, but we're going to see a good recovery out of it. If there's kind of three scenarios that have been played with, the orange line is really the line that we're on. We're expecting to see that vaccine be widely distributed. We're expecting really no big, huge further shutdowns once that gets going. And then we see the employment recover. In a fantasy land, we had a vaccine come out really fast, and then we were able to do that. And of course, we all know that the distribution problems, as well as production problems, that just was never really in the cards. And then there was a concern, and the red line here is if for some reason we get really bogged down in the vaccine delivery, or people don't accept it and don't take it, we could find ourselves on a slower track. But in all the paths forward, there is a full recovery. It just, the question really is depending on how fast we can get people through. All right, Anneliese, we're going to have questions, and then Victoria, you can tell us how much time we have. But I want to encourage you guys, if you already don't, consider following us online through your favorite social media. And we post out about 6 things a day, different articles and publications and reports that you may find interesting. Victoria, how long do we have for questions?
We have 22 minutes. So what I'm going to do is unmute everybody. So everybody prepare for that, and mute yourself back up if you don't want to be unmuted. Okay, everybody's unmuted. And maybe what I'll ask people to do is to raise your hand. And James and Anneliese, do you want to help me keep an eye on who's got their little hand up?
Yes, I can. Let me turn
Sure.
the participant panel on so I can see that.
And the way to raise your hand is to hit the reaction button. And
I'm wondering if
It's already raised his hand.
on time.
okay. Do we have any questions in the chat box that we haven't covered?
Does the EDC have any data on local business closures? Tori, are you tracking that?
We're tracking it anecdotally. So we talk to businesses that are in the process of closing or considering closing it. We don't, because the state doesn't yet have the hard data on that.
Yeah, that's always a really nice data point. That's hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll jump in a little bit. The question of closures, first of all, that is going to be a challenge in San Juan County because of how many are entrepreneurs. If you don't have that's always a challenging one. But in terms of traditional employment arrangements, in terms of who is reporting to us every quarter with unemployment insurance, again, there's about a 6-month lag, but we are going to start getting some data coming in where we can start quantifying how many businesses are contacting us compared to the previous quarter. So that's something that at the end of this month, we will have our first look at the second quarter of 2020, and so we can compare that against the first quarter. So that data is going to roll out slowly and incompletely, but it is coming.
There's a comment in here about the food SNAP and other programs have done some boosted dollars, which are also helping with those low-income household spending, and that's very true. There's been a lot of different things that have influenced that. That has given people dollars because we're trying. I will say overall society has tried, but definitely have seen that. Tara has asked what industries do we anticipate recovering the fastest? And my answer is The ones that will go the slowest are going to be retail and restaurants. Those will be the last ones to recover because they typically are. Fastest, there's some that are already recovered plus, so it's going to vary. Anneliese, you got any?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. One industry that we saw basically do very well during this crisis has been financial industry, specifically the real estate component. You know, we have not seen any slowdown in real estate, especially in the Seattle area. Still seeing a very strong real estate market. So that's one that pretty much didn't even get affected. When I'm thinking about what recovery is going to look like, I'm thinking about economics well, first of all, a lot of it's going to tie into technology. So we know that companies like Amazon have done really well, and that a lot of businesses that have been able to orient their strategies around implementation of technology have done very well. Moving ahead, I'm thinking a lot about technology and the adoption of technology. So after any given recession, we tend to see a lot of businesses looking at, you know, do I invest in technology for certain tasks, or do I invest in workforce? And so there's always a little bit of that shifting that takes place after a recession. I think this one is going to accelerate that trend. So it's a conversation we've had for decades, but I do expect an acceleration because now not only do we have the question of different costs, now we've also got the added and layered on cost of safety and health of your workforce, of your customers, and perceived safety. So I think that that's going to accelerate the adoption of technology. That's something that's been on my mind quite a bit. The industries that already have a lot of technology in place are they're ahead of the curve right now.
Chris Reed asked the $64 million question. I upgraded here. Will the island have a summer tourist season? What say you, Anneliese? Any guesses?
I think that's going to depend a lot on, a lot on behavior when it comes down to it. What's going on with COVID? How comfortable are we with the vaccine at this, coming once we reach summer? I think this next tourist season is probably going to be a bit, I do not expect it to be as catastrophic as this past summer, but I expect it to be rather tepid just because people are starting to make their vacation plans or making their non-vacation plans right now.
I think we also saw a lot of people move their vacation plans from airplanes to RVs to camping. I think the opportunity might be to rethink who you're marketing to as a community, because what we have found in a lot of businesses is in their pivots, they have changed who they're marketing to because it's changed. So your tourist for this next summer season might very well be someone who would normally go to some tropical island, but instead will stay somewhat closer to home because it's safer. And so that may require some rethinking of how you communicate that proposition to them to really leverage that. But we continue to look at July as being that kind of the turning point when we'll see that. So you may see a later season of folks looking for short reach tourist opportunities. And as long as it can be couched in a way of safe and, all the things that we're supposed to be doing, you're likely to find traction with that because you're close. And Hillary, you're actually physically raising your hand. You need to turn on your microphone though.
I'm thinking the quasi-staycation.
Right. I think that Anneliese brings up a really good point about the housing issue. And I think it's something that while we are talking about recovery for a lot of our community, recovery is not going to be possible. This is going to be a fatal and blow because so many of the houses that have sold recently were rental houses. And while we have an eviction moratorium, those people that were living in those houses have had to move. And from what I am seeing, there is no place to move to on island. And in the summertime, especially when we rely on some seasonal workers, those seasonal workers often stay in my barn, which is now housing my son, so it's not available. And I'm guessing that that's the case for many people. We're not going to be putting people on our couches. We're not going to be putting people in our spare bedrooms, because even though we have a vaccine, we won't be very comfortable. So I think while we may be ready to get our businesses back up and running and try to staff them, we're going to see a huge staffing issue coming up. And I don't know if you feel that that's the case, Victoria, but that's certainly something I'm seeing. And then the other issue I was just going to bring up is that over the since March, on Orcas alone, we've distributed $1.2 million in philanthropic dollars for housing assistance, mortgage assistance, food assistance, mental health services. And I think that what we're about to go into in the next 4 months, and I think your slides show that, is that it's going to get a lot darker before it gets light. And those needs are going to be incredible. And we are seeing donor fatigue at this point. So whether or not we can maintain that level of philanthropic support is really questionable. And it does not seem like the government is going to be able to kick in what needs to happen, at least not until after January 20th.
I was going to say, there's a lot of questions on what's going to happen from the government side, both state, right, the legislature, our own legislature. We're posting a video. If you Google Western Insights, you'll find the website. But we just had our state forecast person, Steve Lurch, talk about our state forecast and what the legislator actually will be looking at dollar wise. So that's, if you really want to geek out, that'll get you those numbers. You can think about that. But on the federal side, there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen now and what's going to happen in 2 months. So it's, but what I can say from our side is it's been a story of too little too late, that of what we've seen from a federal response as far as responding to a disaster, because they have not done a full disaster response. Micah, you had your hand up. Oh, you're muted though, and I'm terrible at reading lips.
Am I muted now?
You're perfect.
Okay. People frequently want me muted. My concern hasn't been mentioned in two aspects, and that's the quality and quantity of the returning workforce. Being in a restaurant industry, I've seen, and I've tried to do my best with a very young staff. Age brackets 23 to 30 represents 85% of my staff. And there's a depression, there's a capitulation, there's a sense of whatever, and on they move. And I'm looking at our normal problem of trying to hire into a summer season where we go from 3 FTEs to 9 or 10, regardless of how many people are on staff, just trying to fill those hours. And I'm already seeing likelihood of not being able to do it. Last summer, if we had staff, we would have done our normal schedule, noon to 9 every day. But as it turned out, we just couldn't do it. So we dropped lunches. It turned out to be a reasonable return on dollar for being open, but we didn't have the volume of open hours to pull that money in. And I see that problem not getting better, I see it getting worse. And I talk to the quality of employees, not because they're bad, they're just fatigued like society. And because they're younger, they have no background of maybe resiliency. They've been in the workforce, and now possibly 25% of their workforce life has been on unemployment. And that's not necessarily a good platform to build a quality customer service industry. And I was wondering if there's targets or talk about how to work with that or improve it, or even advertise for getting more people to the island to do this job.
Yeah, I think that's, thinking about the current environment, I
on Thursday. and
I'm kind of
Friday.
thinking about how your comments and questions are tying in with Hillary's comments about real estate. And, you know, a lot of it, especially when you're talking about, you know, a geographically constrained area where you tend to import your seasonal workforce, that question of risk is going to be very much in the minds of your tourists and your residents, but also of your potential workforce. And so it's going to continue to be a really rough season for that reason. I don't know, James, do you have anything to add?
I was going to go from, I think we're going to see some shifts. You know, anytime you come out of a recession, you see some shifts within labor mix, employer mix. You start seeing changes, right? And the United States is way over retailed by the square footage perspective. We have 3 times as much retail as the next developed country. I mean, there's a huge economic cost. That's why some of these large retailers are closing. Gap has announced a couple of weeks ago they closed a huge percentage of their stores because they're expecting 70% of their income to come from online sales moving forward. And we're seeing that in a lot of even local small businesses. They've seen a huge dramatic change in how they're making sales and where they're making sales. And so that's going to impact the labor market in a very interesting way, because if we reduce the number of people in retail, for example, they have to go somewhere. And so they may go into restaurant, they may go into other places. The people that are on unemployment right now will find jobs in some places, and it may not be at the same employer or even in the same industry. They may even wind up getting jobs with higher pay out of all of this as well. And we'll see a shuffle within that market. The one thing you're going to see, though, is from a labor force, the younger folks are going to be looking for work. And so, again, if you can package that as an experience as well as a job, right? So if they could come work in the San Juans and housing is kind of put together for them, and, you know, it's an experience, right? It's like summer camp in some respects, right? Except they're getting paid. That's going to be very, very attractive to someone that's a little more savvy than someone who just says, oh, I need to find a job, right? Because you're packaging experience. And that may be something, I don't know, Victoria, that may be something that's worth looking at and saying, well, maybe we need to come up with a better solution, because we do import all this labor, and we need the labor because we also import all these people they're coming in and spending money and supporting the islands. So I think there's a long range discussion there that has to happen to really think through how do you position.
I think in the short term, you also mentioned some of the solutions you came up with as far as shifting to a lunch service and so forth. And I think that a lot of these smaller, you know, short-term tweaks and also technology plays into that is going to appear in different ways, you know, as strategies from business to business. I know as we see the unemployment rate go down, you know, the opposite situation of where we are right now. But we've often seen situations where certain tasks are shifted to the customer. So depending on the business model, you might do more, you know, bus your own table kinds of models, or, you know, there are ways that different strategies play in, you know, in order to tweak that. But it's going to be a challenging task moving forward.
I agree. And that's actually what we're seeing with the businesses that we're counseling, is the ones that pivoted early to some different mode of operating were the ones who weathered the storm pretty well, the ones that offered delivery or curbside service or a completely different modality. Were able to survive it. And in some cases, they're doing better. You know, I've talked to a few summer just because of the online sales that they've done. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to help our businesses to do that.
The question here about reimagining and repurposing retail real estate space, and it's a hard question because every community is going to be different, but commercial real estate in general is going to go through a transformative process because offices are also changing. You have some very large companies that have decided they don't need offices. REI was building a brand new, headquarters on the east side, didn't even take possession of it. They sold it, ironically, Facebook. And they said that they just don't see themselves going back to an office environment like that. They might do some regional offices, that kind of thing, but they're going to push more people to work remote. More companies are looking at that, but people that are going to go back to offices are going to expect wider hallways, more private spaces, more containment, at least for the next 3 to 5 years, because they're going to be living in this post-COVID mindset, right? So there's going to be just this very wholesale landscape transitions within commercial real estate. And so it's really hard to know what would happen on San Juan versus Orcas because of this, because it's going to depend on what's needed within each community and what's actually available. I think it's JC Penney. I'm going to screw up which chain it is. They closed a bunch of stores and turned them into online fulfillment centers because they're in malls. And they felt that the lease rate on those spaces was so cheap. It's way cheaper than a warehouse. So they're just they've got a little tiny storefront and the rest of it is just warehouse. They're doing retail fulfillment. It makes sense. So you're gonna see just a ton of this over the next couple of years as this kind of shakes out.
Right. That was JCPenney, and
Yeah,
they turned it into Amazon fulfillment centers too. Sorry, Anneliese.
Yeah, just thinking about office space, and I do agree. I think we're seeing a lot of shifts where, again, there are different retail spaces, both physically speaking and in terms of the specific industries, and some are thriving right now and some are struggling. But I do think we're going to see more of that shift towards online retail, and there's the warehousing needs for that. Thinking about commercial real estate, and not retail specifically, but more of office space. Couple things that I've been thinking about. One thing is, there's this question of, are we all going to be working from home now? Is this something that is here to stay? And I guess the way I'm seeing it is, over time, we tend to see shifts. We'll go through 5 years when every tech giant is sending their workers home because that's what the internal surveys say employees want. And so they'll pitch that as a really, a great option, and it works for a while. But you get the shift in leadership, and then you shift back to working more in the office space. And so I expect to see that to continue. I think right now we're in a moment, and I think we can expect this moment for the next several years, where a hybrid approach is going to be attractive, where we've learned collectively on this, we're all collectively on this learning curve where we can meet virtually like this. A lot of us who managed to stay in the workforce managed to get through this with a lot of grace and understanding and compassion, and being able to navigate these new to us technologies for many of us. And we're making it work. Some of my concerns moving forward, though, are what does this mean to people that are either new entrants to the workforce or who were laid off and didn't get this collective learning curve, because now you're going to have another barrier to employment, which is must be able to work from home, work with these different technologies as a job requirement. And so that's something that has me concerned about some of the people that got left out of this collective learning curve. I'm also thinking a bit about I think that that's something that's going to be here to stay as some resilience. And so that is something that's got me concerned, and something that I think every single industry, we need to be preparing our young people and people that are returning to the workforce after an absence about how to adopt these technologies, because there is resilience built into that.
Absolutely. Okay, we're suddenly out of time. That went really fast. It seemed like we had all this time before the question started, and now it's gone. Anneliese and James, thank you so much for coming today. It's always a pleasure to have you speaking to our community, and today, as always, but particularly this year, because we're all so keenly interested in what the heck just happened. And it just feels good to have this combined moment together too. So I want to also thank everybody who came today. Thank you for coming. If you have any questions, reach out to our office. The slideshow and the presentation has been recorded, and we will be putting that on our website forthwith. Thanks, everybody.